It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Dixie Ecklund has been the Associate Director of the Clinical Trials Statistical and Data Management Center at the University of Iowa since 2006. Prior to joining the CTS-DMC, Ms. Ecklund was the Nurse Manager of the General Clinical Research Center at the University of Iowa for nearly 20 years, and she oversaw the implementation of hundreds of clinical research protocols. Currently, the CTS-DMC serves as the Data Coordinating Center for NeuroNext, which is the NINDS-funded Network for Excellence in Neuroscience Clinical Trials, which has implemented 9 protocols which is an NIDD, NIAI funded consortium studying islet cell transplantation. Our second speaker is Marianne Kearney Chase, and she is the Director of Research Operations at the Neurological Clinical Research Institute at Massachusetts Hospital. She's responsible for overall study operations of the NeuroNext clinical, and she joining us. That shows there's a lot of regulations and guidelines of good clinical practices. There's, the U.S. regulations, so there's the Code of Federal Regulations. Typically 21 CFR is what most people refer to when they think about the FDA. And that gives guidance about, electronic documents, informed consent, financial disclosure, IRBs, IND regulations. There's also another Code of Federal Regulations, the Health and Human Services, 45 CFR 46, which also gives, information and guidance about IRBs, about informed consent, inclusion of women, prisoners, and children in research. So as you can see, there's some overlap, and there's a lot of regulations that speak to protection of human subjects, both in 21 CFR as well as in the Health and Human Services Code of Federal Regulations. Again, those are all U.S. There's also international guidance on good clinical practices, and this is the International Conference on Harmonization, ICH E6, typically referred to as E6. That gives information about similar topics, IRBs, investigators, sponsors, and so we're really going to focus primarily on E6 and what some of those regulatory responsibilities are in our presentation today. But first, we want to talk about why do we even regulate clinical trials. As you saw on the last slide, there's a lot of regulation with clinical trials. The main reason to regulate clinical trials is really to ensure the rights, the safety, and the well-being of all human subjects participating in research. That's the underlying principle of good clinical practice, is really to always think about the rights and the welfare of the patients that are actually participating in research. And then from a scientific standpoint, the other really underlying principle of good clinical practices is making sure that you provide good scientific data, and overall you're trying to improve the quality of life and standard of care, again, for patients. So looking at it from a scientific standpoint and making sure there's good integrity of the scientific data. So those are the two reasons why clinical trials are so heavily regulated. So good clinical practices are really a standard that has been set for all aspects of clinical trial management. It's the design, it's the conduct, it's performance, it's all of these, all of these different measures to make sure that all of the integrity of the data is correct and that the patients are being well respected in research. So I won't go through all of these, but again, it's, this is a very broad topic, good clinical practices. So as I said, there's an international conference. There was an international conference on harmonization between the different regions. So this really started back in the 90s. And it was between the US, Europe, and Japan to really think more globally about how to harmonize when they're reviewing drugs that are looking for approval. If a drug shows efficacy and safety to US regulators, we have to think globally, that might also be a benefit in Europe and Japan and other regions of the world. So the regulators really got together to put together this harmonized guidance on how clinical trials should be conducted. And more recently that there have been some revisions to the ICH E6 document on good clinical practices. So as I go through some of the responsibilities in my portion of the presentation, I'm going to point out some of the recent revisions as well. Those were just last year. And this talks a little bit about the revisions as well. What the revisions were really to look at what's happening in clinical research, to make it more manageable, to also encourage really the implementation of efficiency, much more efficient processes, and included things like risk-based monitoring, looking at data integrity and quality management. So again, I'll highlight those as we go through some of the responsibilities. The ICH guideline has many different topics that it covers. There are 8 different sections. I'm going to focus my presentation today, I believe I have a highlight of that, on the requirement of sponsors, the sponsors of a trial, and Dixie is going to focus her comments primarily on the requirement of investigators, but this slide just shows you that there's more to this guidance document than these two. It also regulates, IRB operations, as well as, clinical trial protocols, investigator brochures, essential documents. So it's pretty comprehensive. So I'm going to start off with just a couple of definitions because I often think that people get confused by some of these, and for very good reason. So a sponsor, these are regulatory definitions from the ICH E6 guidance. So a sponsor is really an individual, a company, or an institution or organization that takes responsibility for the initiation, the management, and or the financing of a clinical trial. They have a focus, sponsors have a focus about the overall study objectives, and that they report to regulatory agencies such as the FDA, and they also, if they're at an academic center, they also have some IRB reporting responsibilities. The investigator is really the person that's responsible for conducting the research at an individual clinical trial site. So obviously, as an investigator, the main focus is on subjects, is on the patients that are participating in the research, as well as really the implementation of the protocol as it's written to make sure that it's consistently implemented. Their reporting responsibilities are to their local institutional IRB, or if they may have a central IRB that they've relied on, but so it's really to the IRB, and also reporting to the sponsor. So again, the focus is a little bit different whether you're the sponsor or the investigator. Oftentimes people try to play both roles, right? They try to be both a sponsor and an investigator. So, I know in a lot of the the studies that you guys are thinking about, designing that we talked about in Iowa not too long ago are a lot of times single center studies, and you're going to be both a sponsor, so you're writing the protocol, getting the funding, and you're also going to be enrolling patients. What you need to understand in that role is that this is a role that encompasses a lot of regulation. So this is you as an individual. If you're a sponsor investigator, you both initiate and conduct, either alone or with others, usually with others, a clinical trial, and under whose immediate direction the investigational product or whatever you're testing, the drug, the device, is administered to, dispensed to, or used by a subject. This term, again, from a regulatory standpoint, this term does not mean anyone other than an individual person. It's not your institution. It's not a company or an agency. It's you as an individual have all of these responsibilities. And they're both, all of the responsibilities Dixie and I will review today, both of the sponsor as well as the investigator. And just always like to point out that wearing both hats as an investigator and a sponsor, so you're having to focus on, as a sponsor, looking at the overall goals of your study, but also as an investigator, thinking about the individual patients that you're either enrolling or want to enroll in your study. So wearing both of those hats can be very challenging. I said that twice. Academic trial sponsors, such as many of you, the reason the terms get very confusing is because there is what is considered the regulatory sponsor, and those are the definitions I just went over. This is the person who, from the standpoint of the FDA, has applied to do this research. So they have filed an investigational new drug application to be the regulatory sponsor. So they sign the form that says, I will take on all of the responsibilities of the sponsor. In addition, you have people, your funding sources who consider themselves the sponsor of the research because they fund the research. That's a different type of a sponsor. So that could be NIH, it could be an industry collaborator, foundations. There are different people that sponsor research in terms of finances. But again, they're not the regulatory sponsor that holds the responsibilities. They're the financer. Oftentimes there are centers, coordinating centers, such as in Neuronext, where Dixie and I work with, and some of the other networks out there that assists an academic PI in pulling all of these responsibilities together. So these are people that would help the sponsor investigator. But again, they're not the regulatory sponsor. The regulatory sponsor is the person who files that IND application with FDA. So when do these ICH guidelines, Lyme disease 6 apply? It says that it applies to studies that are conducted in the U.S., which are intended to bring a product to market in any of the regions. So in Europe, Japan, or any of the regions that follow these guidances, or it's for studies that are conducted in those other regions if they intend to submit their results to the FDA for approval in the U.S. I just wanted to point out on this slide, when we say intended to be marketed, I know that none of you are planning on marketing a drug anytime soon, but if your data might be used by a company, the company that owns that drug maybe, to either market that drug or to change the label. So if the drug is already approved for one indication and you're going to test it in a different study population, in order to get that drug approved by insurance companies for patients to actually get reimbursement for, oftentimes the company would need to change the label. That is considered, your study is going to support a marketing application to change that label. So again, I think just to think widely, you may be doing a study at your institution, but you kind of have to think globally. If the company is donating a drug to you or sponsoring your study, are they going to be using that data more widely than just your study? Hopefully, if it works well. This slide is just an overview of all of the different things that have to happen in a clinical trial. All the way from study design, designing the documentation that you're going to be collecting the data on, selecting investigators, going to ethics committees and IRBs, getting their approval, training, and having an investigator meeting so that everybody knows how to conduct the protocol, initiating your sites to begin, enrolling of patients, making sure that the data is valid and verifiable through monitoring, data management, making sure all the queries are answered and all the data is resolved in the end, so that there can be a statistical review and a final report, so that you can then begin the whole study all over again, hopefully with the next phase of trial if your study drug is successful. This slide is just really an overview of showing how long a regulatory process is. You know, things start at the bench and go all the way to, you know, it can take 10, 15, 20 years really to make it to a marketed product. So you may be doing something, a clinical trial in phase 2, and think this will probably never go anywhere, but that could, you know, go on. A company could go on and take it onto a marketing application. So just sort of think about some of those implications. So I'm going to go through the all of the sponsor responsibilities. So again, as the sponsor, you have the responsibility to think about quality in your trials and about delegating tasks. So for quality assurance, making sure that there are standard operating procedures in order to maintain quality in all aspects of the trial and the trial management. One of the new highlights in the revision to E6 is highlighted here in red. It's about using risk-based approaches to quality management. So, you know, really thinking about that in the management. And delegating tasks as a sponsor. If you're going to be using, you know, a CRO, a contract research organization, or a coordinating center, or someone else that's going to take on some of the tasks that are sponsor responsibilities, that needs to be transferred in writing. So there needs to be documentation of who's going to do which tasks. So the regulatory agencies are very clear as to who takes responsibility. This is one of the new things that's pointed out in the E6 guidance is similar to when you're an investigator. When you're a sponsor, you may be able to delegate some trial-related duties, but it's still the sponsor's responsibility to oversee any responsibilities that are delegated. So you still have oversight responsibilities to the CRO and coordinating center to make sure that all of those responsibilities are happening. Sponsors often delegate medical expertise, so they usually hire a medical monitor or a medical safety monitor to help advise on the study and help to answer medical related questions when those come up at the sites. Trial design and management. So sponsors are responsible for, you know, always having qualified staff and showing that those staff are qualified and have the experience to do the jobs that they've been employed to do, to both, you know, in all aspects, designing the study, analyzing the study, managing all aspects of a trial. There's another portion to this is making sure that when you have any electronic data that's captured, making sure that the electronic data capture system is validated and is secure, and that there are SOPs that maintain how that data integrity will be intact. And that again was highlighted in the new revisions of E6, is making sure, as we all know, everything has gone electronic. We do our banking, we do shopping, we do everything online. So making sure that, you know, anything done electronically, you really assess the risk and you look at making sure that your clinical trial data has integrity. Sponsors are responsible for selecting sites and for contracting with those sites. So making sure that the sites that are selected are trained and qualified to be able to conduct the research as it's written. And making sure that there's a contract in place that talks about compensation of subjects and investigators. So sites need to be paid for all procedures that are done at their institution. And there also needs to be provisions for if there are research-related injuries or trial-related injuries to subjects, who's going to pay for that? That all needs to be worked out in a contract between the sponsor and each institution. And that's typically also disclosed to patients who are interested in participating in the study in the informed consent form. So it's important to have all of that documentation done before starting a trial. The sponsor is responsible for regulatory submissions. So again, submitting applications to the FDA or any other regulatory body if it's being done in other regions in Europe or Japan or elsewhere. The sponsor also needs to confirm that any site that's participating in the research has oversight by an institutional review board. Again, it may be their local institutional review board, or it could be a centralized institutional review board, either an academic one or a commercial one. The sponsor needs to collect that information to ensure that the research is being conducted in compliance with good clinical practice guidelines. The sponsor is responsible for all aspects of the investigational product. So they need to inform investigators and explain to them about that investigational product. And if they have new safety information or new information about that drug, they need to provide that to the investigators via the investigator's brochure whenever anything significant comes up about that product. They are responsible for making sure that the drug is manufactured and handled in a way that is consistent with good manufacturing principles. They have to supply the sites with drug and placebo if it's a controlled study, and making sure that they only do so once a site is approved to begin enrollment in a study. If there's a blinded study, again, if it's an active drug and placebo, the sponsor is responsible to make sure that there are systems in place to ensure that the blind is kept. They also need to make sure that there's going to be a timely resupply. So they have to make sure there's enough drug manufactured such that the study would not need to be stopped due to a drug shortage. The sponsor is ultimately responsible for safety. They need to do ongoing safety evaluations. They need to inform investigators and the institutions in which the research is being conducted, as well as any regulatory authorities about any safety or anything that can adversely affect subject safety during the study. If there are adverse drug reactions, something that's attributable to the actual investigational product, sponsors are responsible to submit those to regulatory agencies if they are serious and unexpected. They have a very short time window to submit those to regulatory agencies. If they don't meet that requirement, they still need to submit them to regulatory agencies on a periodic basis. So they have very strong responsibilities in safety. Monitoring is a piece that comes up all the time. So monitoring of data is very important from a sponsor standpoint. The monitors typically go to this both remotely and on site. They make sure that the trial data is accurate, that it's complete, and that it's verifiable. So if someone entered data into the electronic data capture system, the monitor should be able to go on site and find where that source of data came from and make sure that it matches what was entered into the electronic data capture system. They also look on site and make sure that the protocol is being followed and that all good clinical practice guidelines and other regulatory requirements are being followed. This, as you can see with all the bullets here in red, this was a big focus of the revision of E6 last year. Really focusing on a risk-based approach and prioritizing and making sure that we're really looking at the key elements when monitoring to make sure we don't get caught in the weeds, but actually really look at the important activities and make sure that all of the monitoring activities are documented. Non-compliance. So non-compliance does happen occasionally in clinical research. It is a sponsor's responsibility to act quickly in situations where there is non-compliance. And if you work with an investigative site and there's ongoing non-compliance and it's persistent, then the sponsor is really responsible for terminating that investigator's participation in the research. This is, again, an area that was a focus when the guidance was recently revised. So again, really looking at compliance and making sure that the protocol is implemented properly is an important responsibility of the sponsor. If for any reason a study needs to be terminated early or suspended, it's important that the sponsor notify all of the investigators, their institutions, regulatory authorities, and also to advise the sites to inform their local IRB or their institution or any central IRB that might be overseeing the research. Sponsors are also responsible for producing clinical study reports and providing those to regulatory agencies as required. And as you can imagine, conducting a trial at one single center has complexities, but then turning that into a trial that goes to 20 different centers across the U.S. or even more so, as you know, a lot of the drug companies are doing global studies at 50 or 100 centers across many regions. So it's really important, and there's a special section in this E6 document that focuses on multi-center trials and making sure that all investigators that are participating in a multi-center trial, making sure that the sponsor is responsible for designing those case report forms to make sure that all centers are doing this exactly the same, making sure that the training of each of these investigators is documented, and that the fact that they are given instructions about how to comply with the protocol, having a uniform set of standards across all sites that are participating in a multi-center study is essential in order to have good validated data at the end of your trial. And also the sponsor is responsible to make sure that there's communication between investigators and that they, as the sponsor, actually facilitate that communication.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm happy to take over here from Marianne. She gave us a nice introduction to GCP and sponsor responsibilities. I'm going to focus a little bit more on investigator responsibilities or obligations. And these would apply whether you're conducting a trial at your site only, a single site trial, or also if you're involved in a multi-site trial. So we'll try to cover both of those areas and apply those to what your future experience might be. So site investigator responsibilities are to protect the rights, safety, and welfare of study subjects and to ensure that the investigation is conducted according to the approved protocol and applicable regulations, and to control the drug supply. So safety first, we have to protect the rights and safety and welfare of subjects. The regulations are certainly appropriate to follow and to think about that the investigation is conducted according to the regulations. And the drug supply, we need to make sure that, especially investigational drugs, there's even stricter regulatory requirements on investigational drugs to make sure that they're properly stored, properly managed, properly dispensed, and documentation of all those things. Oh dear. I lost the connection. Oh, there I go. Okay. Now I lost the ability to advance the screen. There's a lot of echo. Hold on a minute. Okay, is this better? Can you all hear me? Somebody shake your head yes, Marianne. Okay, all right. So all the site investigators' responsibilities, most of these are listed on the 1572, but not all are. This is an example of a Form 1572 that you would be required to sign to the FDA if you are the PI of a multi-center clinical trial or a trial at your site only. This details some of the responsibilities that need to be included. And here it points out the different regulatory statutes that apply. This is where you're making commitments and signing that you are taking responsibility for the conduct of the trial at your site. It's important to keep calm and take the responsibility on. Additional requirements for investigator obligations are to provide reasonable medical care for the study subjects that you might be inviting to participate in the trial, to provide reasonable access to medical care. The investigator should be available 24/7. Somebody needs to be available 24/7 in the event that there's an adverse event or some medical occurrence that would require some kind of intervention. It's also required that there's adherence to the protocol so that subjects aren't exposed to unreasonable risks. If you fail to adhere to the inclusion-exclusion criteria, perhaps enrolling a subject who was not eligible because they had renal failure and not excluding them when the investigational drug might be nephrotoxic would be a lack of adherence to the protocol and not responding to your investigator obligations. Another example would be a failure to get a safety measure such as a CBC when the investigational therapy that you're using might cause neutropenia. The site investigator should also think about informing the participant's primary physician if a participant chooses to join a trial, but the subject would, you would want them to agree to that. But it's always a good thing to take on if you're an investigator in a trial, that you would work with the primary physician so that they're aware of that their particular patient might be participating in a research trial. Another important thing to think about is delegation of task. Marianne talked about that a little bit in sponsored delegation or transfer of obligations to site investigators. If you're a site investigator, you might be able to delegate some of the tasks, and you probably need to delegate some of the tasks because no one person can do all these things in order to meet the requirements of the particular clinical trial. But it's still important to remember that as the principal investigator, when you delegate tasks, you are responsible for choosing qualified individuals to perform the task, to provide adequate training for the delegated tasks and on the protocol, and to provide adequate supervision and oversight. And if you've never seen a delegation log, they can be quite lengthy and detail all of these tasks, but it's important to clearly define all those things so that it's crystal clear to the regulatory bodies and the study team themselves on who is responsible for which tasks. Some of the tasks that are commonly seen by the FDA on inspections to be inappropriately delegated would be things like a medical history or assessment of inclusion-exclusion criteria on screening evaluations. Those should be delegated to people who actually are licensed staff, not somebody's secretary who might be trying to consent people to a particular study that you might be participating in. Physical exams would be another example. Evaluation of adverse events, those should definitely be reviewed by a person with clinical expertise, and most appropriately the investigator or people who are named on the delegation log or on the 1572 as qualified investigators. Other inappropriately delegated tasks include assessing the primary study endpoints or obtaining informed consent. The investigator is accountable for the regulatory violations resulting from failure to adequately supervise the conduct of the clinical study. So an investigator should ensure that there's adequate training of the staff at his site. So they need to ensure that their study staff are familiar with the purpose of the study and the protocol, that they have an adequate understanding of the specific details of the protocol and whatever tasks that they're assigned to do, that they're aware of the regulatory requirements and acceptable standards for conduct of clinical trials and protection of the human subjects. So that would be CITI training or GCP training, and that they're competent to perform the tasks. There are many assessments that go on in clinical trials. I mean, here the example is an ECG or vital signs or FVC, any kind of bedside or clinic kind of assessments that might be undertaken. It's the investigator's responsibility to make sure that his staff or her staff is competent to perform these and that they're delegated appropriately. And the staff also need to be informed of any pertinent protocol changes so that they are certain that they are conducting the protocol in compliance with the currently approved protocol. Falls to the investigator. So in addition to adequate training, we need to have adequate supervision by the site investigators. The site investigators need to have sufficient time to properly conduct and supervise a clinical trial, and that needs to be demonstrated on site selection. So this can be a hard thing to do without protected research time. So you need to work with people within your institution to assure that you do have adequate time to before you actually take on a protocol as principal investigator to ensure that the trial will be properly conducted and supervised. The FEDA has identified some other factors that might affect the ability of an investigator to provide adequate supervision, and that would include inexperienced study staff, too demanding of a workload for the study staff, very complex and complicated clinical trials, a large number of subjects enrolled at a site, a very seriously ill subject population that introduces other complications into the protocol, an investigator who's conducting multiple studies concurrently at a site, or an investigator who might be off location and doesn't have direct oversight of the particular project going on. One thing to think about if you take on the role of a PI at your site to provide adequate supervision is to develop a supervision plan. This can be extremely beneficial. We've been to sites where the monitors will go in to meet with a study staff at a site, and I've actually seen this happen where the PI introduces himself to the on-site coordinator, and they had never met before, even though they've been conducting a study, for a year together. So this is only going to lead to problems in the conduct of your study. Supervision and routine to document the performance of the delegation log, training, supervision of those IRB understands, who's allowed to consent, what are the circumstances of consenting, and in particular, making sure they understanding that consenting is an ongoing process and not something that only occurs once. You need to assure that there's a procedure for ensuring source data are accurate, updated, and original, so that source verification can occur, any kind of on-site or centralized monitoring can occur, to ensure that the source data reflects what's been submitted into a database. You also need to make sure that you're able to meet with the study monitor and deal with any of the queries, questions, findings that might come up from a study monitor visit. And finally, a procedure for addressing medical and ethical issues that arise during the trial and keeping all the regulatory bodies informed. Sponsor the site selection. With that, They would also like to know what the IRB process and timelines are at your particular institution. Um, there I think everyone's aware there are new initiatives underway where there are a lot of central IRBs coming up, especially for phase 3 or NIH funded trials. So it might be a single IRB, but and so you know those questions would be answered differently in this particular instance. But there are still many trials going on where the and especially in industry where there is a a single IRB or the local IRB would be the governing body. You also need to understand what the contracts process and timelines are at your particular institution. This is something that can take quite a bit of time, usually through a sponsor programs office. And or grant accounting office, and you need to be able to respond on the site selection questionnaire, what your PI experience is in clinical trials, and if you have an experienced clinical research coordinator or clinical research nurse who will assist in the project. These, okay. It's important that when you are filling out a site selection questionnaire that you give accurate information information with reasonable estimates and respond quickly to the questionnaire. If you are interested in participating. So a site activation checklist. These are all the requirements that you need to fulfill before your site is able to participate in a trial. And you take on those investigator responsibilities. Um, uh,
Questions? If you do have questions, you can just enter them in the chat box. We'll give it a few moments. In the meantime, if you're interested in CMEs for this webinar, please complete the evaluation form.
Who should someone contact if they have a in there?
Oh, Dixie, you have to grab the microphone.
Signed by the PI as part of GCP and investigator obligations. And it also is part of GCP that a note is written into the research records or the medical records that the patient was properly consented, all questions were answered, and in addition, a randomization note that the subject was eligible for randomization on this date and at this time. After you begin enrolling, your investigator obligations continue with the follow-up visits, things that can guide you through.
Okay. Are there any further questions? Looks like not. So thank you, Marianne. Thank you so much for joining us. The webinar, improve the series. So I've posted the link to the evaluation form in the web links box now. So you should be able to just click the link, the bit.ly link, and then click Browse To, and it'll take you directly to the evaluation. The webinar today is eligible for 1 AMA PRA Category 1 credit. And so you'll be asked to provide your email address on the evaluation form, and then your CME will be provided at the end of the series, which is in November. And we're going to post the today's webinar and slides to the course website. It should be up by early next week. And our next webinar is on September 15th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And the topic will be on trial management. Thank you everyone again for joining. Thank you, Marianne and Dixie.